The air inside Williams Corporation was thick with the scent of wealth, expensive perfume, leather chairs and fresh brewed coffee. The floors gleamed under the golden light of the massive chandeliers, and the towering glass walls reflected the city's skyline like a mirror. It was a kingdom of the rich, ruled by power and arrogance. But within this palace of luxury, Mrs. Johnson moved like a shadow. Dressed in her faded blue cleaning uniform, she pushed her mop across the marble floors, the rhythmic sound drowned by the chatter and laughter of the company's elite. They walked past her as though she were invisible, their designer heels clicking against the floor. They never noticed her. But she noticed everything. She had been working here for 3 months, watching, listening, learning. Every conversation, every cruel smirk, every insult whispered behind closed doors. They thought she was nobody. The executives, the managers, the employees, they all treated her like dirt. "Hey, you missed a spot," one of them sneered one morning, kicking over his empty coffee cup so it rolled at her feet. Mrs. Johnson bent down without a word, picked it up, and threw it into her cleaning cart. She had long learned that words were useless here. Laughter followed her wherever she went. They mocked the stains on her uniform, the worn-out sneakers she wore, the way her hair was always hidden under a plain scarf. "I wonder if she even showers," a woman whispered to her colleague, giggling. "Poor people smell different," the man chuckled in response. Mrs. Johnson kept her head down and continued scrubbing. They had no idea who she really was. If there was one person who was worse than all of them, it was Mr. Josh, the CEO. He ran the company like a dictator, ruling with an iron fist. His office was on the highest floor, unreachable to most employees unless they were being fired. And people got fired a lot. One mistake, one misstep, one word he didn't like, and you were gone. Mrs. Johnson had seen it all. A single mother fired for leaving the office at exactly 5 p.m. to pick up her child. A junior executive humiliated and kicked out for bringing up a new idea in a meeting. A janitor screamed at for accidentally spilling water near the CEO's office. Fear was the law in this building. One day Mrs. Johnson had just finished mopping near the entrance when a man in a cheap suit rushed in, sweat dripping down his face. "Please, just let me talk to Mr. Josh," he begged the receptionist. "I'm sorry, but you no longer work here," the receptionist replied coldly, flipping through a fashion magazine. The man looked desperate. "I just need to explain. My wife is in the hospital, and I needed time to..." The elevator doors opened, and Mr. Josh himself stepped out. Tall, well-dressed, and radiating arrogance. He barely glanced at the man before waving him off like a fly. "Security," he said lazily. 2 guards grabbed the man's arms and began dragging him toward the exit. "Please, sir. I worked here for 5 years. Just listen to me." "I don't listen to failures," Mr. Josh said, adjusting his expensive Rolex. "Now get out before I have you arrested for trespassing." Mrs. Johnson gripped her mop tighter. Her fingers trembled with silent rage. But still she said nothing. She simply watched, observed. The kingdom of Williams Corporation was rotting from the inside. And the time was coming. One morning Mrs. Johnson was cleaning near the executive's lounge when she accidentally bumped into a young junior executive, Mr. Bradley, who was holding a large cup of coffee. Splash! The coffee spilled all over his expensive white suit. Gasps filled the room before they erupted into laughter. "Oh my God! Look at this mess!" Mr. Bradley shouted. One of his colleagues chuckled. "Of course it's the cleaning lady. I guess she wanted to give herself more work." Laughter echoed through the hallway as Mrs. Johnson muttered an apology and quickly tried to clean up. She probably tripped over her own rags. Someone sneered, making them all laugh harder. Mrs. Johnson kept her head down and cleaned the mess while they mocked her clumsiness, whispering and snickering as they walked away. Days turned into weeks. The insults, the laughter, the humiliation, it continued. But Mrs. Johnson endured it all, waiting, watching, until one fateful morning. It was just another day. The sun rose over the city, painting the sky in golden hues. Inside Williams Corporation, the employees laughed, sipped their expensive coffees, and walked past the silent cleaner without a glance. Mrs. Johnson had one more task to complete before her shift ended. She had to clean the CEO's office. Taking a deep breath, she pushed her cleaning cart into the private elevator and pressed the top floor button. As the doors slid shut, she stared at her reflection in the polished steel walls. Poor woman. Nobody. A joke to them. But that was about to change. The elevator dinged, and she stepped out into the grand office. Mr. Josh sat behind his enormous glass desk, leaning back in his leather chair, flipping through a file with boredom. When he saw her, he scowled. Not now. I just had a meeting. Mrs. Johnson bowed slightly. I'm just here to clean, sir. Then hurry up. And don't touch anything with your dirty hands. She swallowed the bitter taste in her mouth and started dusting. A few minutes passed in silence, but then Mr. Josh sighed dramatically. You know, people like you are the reason this city stinks. Mrs. Johnson paused. Her grip on the duster tightened. Poor people, he continued, spinning his chair toward her. You're all the same. Always begging, always complaining. If you had worked harder in life, maybe you wouldn't be a lowly cleaner. Mrs. Johnson's heart pounded. The blood in her veins burned. You had no idea. Tell me, how does it feel? Mr. Josh smirked. Scrubbing floors while people like me make real money. Mrs. Johnson looked up slowly. For the first time she met his gaze. And for the first time he saw something in her eyes that made him pause. It wasn't fear. It wasn't submission. It was something else. Something dangerous. But before he could say anything, she simply bowed her head again and turned to leave. That's right, he chuckled. Know your place. Mrs. Johnson didn't respond. She stepped out of the office, walked into the elevator and let the doors close. Her face was unreadable. The next morning, Williams Corporation awoke to another day of luxury, power, and quiet suffering. Mr. Josh sat in his high-rise office, sipping imported coffee, staring out over the city skyline like a king surveying his kingdom. The world below belonged to him. The employees in this building, they were nothing more than disposable pieces on his chessboard. And he played with them however he pleased. The employees moved through the halls like ghosts, their eyes darting around in constant fear. Everyone knew the rules. Never question Mr. Josh. Never challenge his authority. Never show weakness. Because weakness was punished. Mrs. Johnson had watched 3 months of cruelty. She had seen a young intern break into tears after being humiliated in front of the board. She had watched a brilliant marketing manager, one of the best in the industry, get fired because Mr. Josh didn't like the color of her presentation slides. And just last week, she had seen a security guard lose his job for daring to sneeze in the CEO's presence. But the moment that pushed Mrs. Johnson over the edge happened later that afternoon. It started with David, a hard-working accountant. He had been at the company for 7 years, known for his dedication and honesty. He wasn't rich, but he worked hard to provide for his family. That day, he was called into the CEO's office. Mrs. Johnson happened to be cleaning the hallway when she heard the shouting. She glanced toward the office door, which was slightly ajar. She saw everything. Mr. Josh stood behind his desk, a look of cold amusement on his face. David was sweating, his hands shaking. Sir, please. It was a small miscalculation. Just a tiny error on one report. I caught it before it even went through. It won't happen again. Clem. Mr. Josh threw a pen at him, the expensive gold tip hitting David's chest before falling to the floor. You think I care? Mr. Josh sneered. You're fired. David's mouth fell open. Please, sir, I don't need excuses from a failure. Sir, my wife, she just gave birth. Have hospital bills. Do I look like I care? Mr. Josh leaned forward, his eyes dark with mockery. David's lips trembled. His fingers clutched at his tie, struggling for breath. But Mr. Josh had already turned away, waving a hand toward the door like David was a speck of dust. Mrs. Johnson felt something crack inside her. David swallowed his pride, his shoulders slumping. He turned toward the door, wiping his eyes. And then Mr. Josh laughed. It was cold, amused, as if a man's entire life meant nothing. Mrs. Johnson's hands curled into fists. This was enough. More than enough. It was time. Time to end this. That night, whispers began to spread through Williams Corporation. Rumor. Mystery. A warning. Have you heard? Someone whispered near the water cooler. There's an investor. A secret one. Someone who owns a huge percentage of the company. Yeah, right, another employee scoffed. I'm serious. Nobody knows who it is, but I heard they've been watching. Waiting. For what? For the right moment. Mrs. Johnson heard all of this as she pushed her cleaning cart through the hallway. Nobody suspected her. Nobody even looked at her. But soon the entire building would be looking at her. Tomorrow she would walk through these doors, and she would not be wearing a cleaner's uniform. The reign of Mr. Josh was about to come to an end, and he had no idea. The air inside Williams Corporation was always the same, cold, sterile, filled with the quiet hum of computers and the fake laughter of the wealthy. But this morning was different. Employees arrived at their desks, chattering about deadlines, sales reports, and office gossip. But then everything stopped. The sound of heels clicking against the marble floor made heads turn. Someone important had entered the building. The scent of wealth filled the air. Rich, expensive perfume, the kind that only the elite could afford. A presence so powerful, so undeniable, that even the most arrogant executives found themselves staring. A woman, dressed in an elegant white designer suit, her hair styled perfectly, her jewelry glistening under the golden office lights, walked through the building like she owned it. 'Cause she did. Mrs. Johnson had arrived. Nobody recognized her at first. The same employees who had mocked her, thrown their coffee cups at her, ignored her greetings, now stared as if they were seeing a ghost. "Who is she?" someone whispered. "Is she a new executive?" "No way, she looks like someone important." The receptionist, the same woman who had often smirked at Mrs. Johnson while she cleaned, shot up from her desk. "Good morning, ma'am. How can I assist you?" she said, her voice suddenly sweet, her usual dismissive tone nowhere to be found. Mrs. Johnson didn't even look at her. She walked past all of them, her heels clicking, her confidence filling every inch of the space. The same hallway where she had once pushed a cleaning cart, she now walked through like she owned the world. And then she stepped into the private elevator. She pressed the top floor button. Mr. Josh had no idea what was coming. Mr. Josh leaned back in his chair, scrolling through his phone. Another morning. Another day of making money. A knock at the door. "Did I schedule a meeting?" he called, frowning. No answer. Just the soft click of the door opening. His eyes flicked up and then widened. The woman standing in his office radiated power. Everything about her. The way she stood, the way she looked directly at him with an expression of absolute authority, sent a chill down his spine. Something about her felt familiar. But he couldn't place it. Still, he was Mr. Josh, CEO, the most powerful man in the building. So he leaned back in his chair and smirked. "You must be new here," he said lazily. "If you need a meeting with me, my assistant should have scheduled it." Mrs. Johnson said nothing. She walked forward, slowly, deliberately, and placed a golden envelope on his desk. Mr. Josh frowned. "What's this?" he muttered, grabbing the envelope and ripping it open. His eyes scanned the paper. And then, his face lost all color. His hands trembled. His smug smirk vanished. His breath caught in his throat. Because what he was holding was a letter from the company's majority investor. A letter from the person who truly controlled Williams Corporation. And it was signed with one name. Mrs. Evelyn Johnson. "I own this company." The room fell into silence. Mr. Josh's hands clenched the paper as if trying to make it disappear. His heart pounded. His mind raced. This couldn't be. This had to be a joke. He looked up, truly looked at her this time. And suddenly he saw her. The eyes were the same. The face was the same. Cleaner. The woman he had insulted. The woman he had mocked. The woman he had treated like she was nothing. And she was his boss. Mr. Josh shot up from his chair so fast that it nearly tipped over. "Wait, this is some kind of mistake, right?" he stammered. Mrs. Johnson tilted her head slightly, her eyes still calm. "No," she said. Her voice was smooth, powerful, and unwavering. "There's no mistake." She took a step closer. "I own this company." And then Mr. Josh fell apart. The begging begins. His legs nearly gave out beneath him. He gripped the edge of his desk, his breathing shaky. He had spent years running this company like a king. Years crushing people beneath his feet. And now, the one person he had mocked the most was the one person who had the power to destroy him. "Mrs. Johnson, please," his voice cracked. He tried to smile, to pretend like nothing had happened. I didn't know. If I had known." Mrs. Johnson's gaze was cold, unforgiving. "You mean if you had known I was rich," she said. Mr. Josh's throat tightened. "And no, that's not what I—" She raised a hand. He immediately shut up. Mrs. Johnson turned toward the glass window, staring down at the city below. "You've run this company like a tyrant," she said, her voice calm yet filled with weight. Mr. Josh gulped. "You've fired hard-working people for no reason. You've insulted your employees. You've treated them like they were beneath you." She turned back to him, her eyes piercing through his soul. "And yesterday," she continued, "I watched you laugh as a man begged you for his job. A man with a newborn baby at home. A man who had done nothing wrong except make a small mistake." She took a deep breath. "I'm afraid you're no longer the right person for this job." Mr. Josh's knees hit the floor. "Please," he choked. His voice was desperate now. "Mrs. Johnson, Evelyn, please. Just one more chance. I can change. I can do better." He clasped his hands together, begging. Mrs. Johnson shook her head slowly. "No, Mr. Josh." She turned toward the door. "Security will escort you out." And just like that, it was over. Mr. Josh, the once mighty CEO, had fallen. By the time Mrs. Johnson stepped out of the office, the entire building had heard. The whispers turned into shock. The employees who had once laughed at her, ignored her, thrown trash at her, now they stood frozen in fear. They had all treated her like a nobody. And now she owned everything. The woman they had insulted held their futures in her hands. Mrs. Johnson didn't say a word to them. She simply walked through the hallway, her heels clicking, her presence more powerful than ever. And at that moment, every person in that building realized the truth. The news spread like wildfire throughout the entire building. The once feared CEO, Mr. Josh, was gone, fired, disgraced. And the one who had taken him down, the cleaning lady, or rather, the woman they had all mocked, humiliated, and ignored. The one who had been watching. The one who had been waiting. Mrs. Evelyn Johnson. The whispers turned into stunned silence as she walked through the office. The same people who used to laugh at her now lowered their gazes in shame. No one dared to speak. 'Cause they all knew. They had treated her like dirt. Now she was their boss. And every single one of them was at her mercy. Security had arrived within minutes. The two guards stood in the CEO's office waiting. Mr. Josh sat frozen in his chair, his face pale, his hands gripping the edge of the desk like a man holding on to the last moments of his power. "This is a joke, right?" His voice was shaky, his confidence completely gone. Neither of the guards answered. They just waited. Mrs. Johnson watched him from the doorway, her expression unreadable. "Take him out," she said. And just like that, it was over. The mighty had fallen. Mr. Josh had spent years walking through these halls like a king. Now he stumbled through them, escorted by security, his face red with humiliation. The same employees who had once feared him now watched in stunned silence. No one spoke. No one moved. They simply stared. And Mr. Josh felt it. The weight of their gazes. The whispers behind his back. The power he had once held over them was gone. For the first time in his life he was nothing. He reached the glass doors of the building, the place he had ruled for years. He turned one last time searching. For pity. For mercy. For someone. Anyone. To say something. But there was nothing. Not a single person looked at him with kindness. And then the doors opened. A gust of cold city air hit his face. And just like that he was out. Forever. Back inside the employees stood frozen. Fear clawed at their throats. Mrs. Johnson turned slowly, her gaze sweeping over the very people who had laughed at her just days ago. Some flinched. Some looked away. All of them knew they were next. She stepped forward, her heels clicking against the marble. Each step felt like a judgment. The receptionist, the same woman who used to ignore her greetings, swallowed hard. The executives, the ones who used to mock her clothes, now stood stiff, their hands trembling. Every single one of them had something to fear, because they had all treated her like nothing. And now they were in her hands. Mrs. Johnson finally stopped in the center of the office. Her voice was calm, steady, powerful. "I have been watching all of you," she said. The room tensed. Her eyes scanned them one by one. "For 3 months, I have seen how this company is run." She took a slow breath. "I have seen cruelty. I have seen disrespect. I have seen people treated like trash because of their position. No one dared to move. And today," she continued, her voice firm, "that ends." A collective gulp swept through the office. "I will not run this company the way Mr. Josh did," she said. "But make no mistake, things will change." Her next words sent chills down their spines. "And those who cannot change will not stay." The employees knew what that meant. Some were safe. The ones who had treated people with kindness, with respect. But the others, the ones who had laughed, insulted, stepped on others to climb higher. They knew their time was running out. They had mocked the wrong woman. And now they would pay the price. Mrs. Johnson turned toward the large conference room. "Board members," she said, "meeting now." And just like that she took control. As she stepped into the conference room, Mrs. Johnson took a deep breath. This company had been built on arrogance and cruelty. But that was about to change. She wasn't here for revenge. She was here for justice. For the hard-working employees who had suffered. For the ones who had been mistreated. For every single person who had been made to feel small. She was here to fix it all. And nothing would stop her. The boardroom was silent. The executives, the same ones who had laughed at Mrs. Johnson, sat stiff in their seats. They were used to power, to control, to sitting at the top while others struggled below them. But today, they were the ones afraid. Mrs. Johnson stood at the head of the long glass table. Her presence undeniable. She didn't need to raise her voice to command respect. She already had it. She placed a folder on the table. Thick, heavy folder filled with names. Names of the corrupt, the cruel, the ones who had taken advantage of their positions. The ones who had contributed to the company's downfall. "Things are going to change," she said. One by one she listed the names. And one by one they were removed. The HR director who had fired employees for petty reasons. The executive who had stolen credit for other people's work. The managers who had mistreated employees, humiliated interns, and abused their power. By the time the meeting ended, half of the leadership team was out. And the ones who remained, they knew they had to change, or be next. Mrs. Johnson took her place at the very top. For the first time in years, Williams Corporation had a leader who actually cared. She met with employees. She listened to their struggles. She revoked unfair policies and brought back the ones who had been wrongfully fired. And as the days passed, something incredible happened. The fear that once filled the office began to fade. The employees who had once walked on eggshells, afraid of making mistakes, began to breathe again. They no longer worked out of fear. They worked with pride. Meanwhile, outside the walls of Williams Corporation, Mr. Josh sat alone. His expensive suit now wrinkled. His once powerful name, now meaningless. He had been a king. Now he was nothing. He tried everything, calling old business partners, reaching out to friends, begging for favors. But nobody wanted to be associated with a disgraced CEO. Nobody cared. For the first time in his life, he felt what it was like to be powerless. And in that moment he understood. The very people he had crushed beneath his feet. Now he was the one on the ground. Days passed. He tried applying for jobs at other corporations, but every CEO knew what had happened. His name was ruined. His arrogance, his cruelty, his lack of leadership. Nobody wanted a man like him anywhere near their company. His money started running out. His penthouse, his luxury car, sold. And finally, the once mighty CEO of Williams Corporation found himself in a tiny, run-down apartment, with nothing left but regret. For the first time in his life, he understood what it was like to be powerless, to be on the other side. And it haunted him. One rainy evening, as Mrs. Johnson prepared to leave her office, a security guard hesitated at her door. "Ma'am, there's someone here to see you." Mrs. Johnson arched an eyebrow. The guard shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Josh." She sighed and nodded. "Let him in." When the door opened, she barely recognized him. He looked thinner. His suit, once crisp and perfect, was now creased and slightly dirty. And most shocking of all, his arrogance was gone. "Mrs. Johnson," he said softly. His voice was hoarse, almost broken. She said nothing. "I lost everything," he admitted. "I never thought I'd say this, but..." He swallowed hard. "I understand now." Mrs. Johnson studied him, her face unreadable. "I never treated people as humans," he continued. "I stepped on everyone to get to the top, and now..." He let out a shaky breath. "I'm the one on the ground." A long silence stretched between them. Finally Mrs. Johnson spoke. "Do you want me to feel sorry for you?" Mr. Josh froze. He had expected pity. But there was none in her eyes. "I'm not here for sympathy," he said quickly. I just wanted to say I understand. And I'm sorry." Mrs. Johnson tilted her head. "Good," she said simply. Mr. Josh blinked. "That's it. You wanted a lesson, Mr. Josh," she said. "And life gave you one." She picked up her handbag and walked toward the door. Before leaving, she looked back at him one last time. "Let's see what you do with it." And then she was gone, leaving him alone, standing in the ruins of his own mistakes. Back at Williams Corporation, the company thrived under its new leadership. It became a place where people wanted to work, a company where hard work was rewarded, and employees were treated with respect. The same employees who had once mocked Mrs. Johnson now spoke of her with reverence. They had learned a lesson they would never forget. Never underestimate someone just because of their appearance. Never treat people as if they are beneath you, because the person you belittle today could be the person who owns everything tomorrow. One evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, Mrs. Johnson took a slow walk through the office. She passed the desks, the hallways, the very same places where she had once pushed a cleaning cart. But this time, people greeted her with respect. They didn't look down on her. They didn't mock her, because they had seen what true power looked like. And it wasn't in money, suits, or expensive watches. It was in character. She smiled to herself. She had won. Not just against Mr. Josh. Not just against the arrogant executives. But against a system that had never expected her to rise. And yet she had.